Good afternoon and welcome to our final panel this week as Tennessee Achieves takes a quick break to celebrate 100,000 students enrolled. This is panel 14 out of 14. So I hope that our panelists today are ready to finish us strong. We appreciate them all being here today. We're going to take a dive at what Tennessee Achieves and Tennessee Promise have meant, not only in Tennessee, but outside of Tennessee and across the country, and a look at what the free college movement looks like around the nation. So we really appreciate our panelists being here today. We've got a really esteemed panel that Christy's going to introduce and moderate, but I'm really excited that you're all here. I think we're going to end on a really, really high note. For our attendees today, you will notice that you are muted and your cameras are turned off, but you are able to interact with our panelists and ask your questions. At the bottom, you'll see a couple of different options. There's a chat box where you can chat amongst yourselves as well as with our panelists. And there's also a Q&A box where you can ask your questions. Chrissy's going to moderate our panel today. She has some questions ready for them, but we're also going to collect your questions. We want to get anything that you might want to know answered. So fire your questions away there. I'll come back at the end and ask them to our panelists, but really excited about this panel. And I guess this is my last chance this week to introduce our executive director and my boss for the last 12 or 11 years, Chrissy. So I guess I better say something really nice this time, end on a high note this week before the weekend kicks off. But Chrissy, our boss, our one and only executive director at Tennessee Achieves, and someone that I can't imagine going to work and doing this work with anyone else every single day, and the team that we all have assembled here at Tennessee Achieves. It's been a great week, and for the last time, I'll introduce Chrissy, our executive director.
Thanks, Graham. We really do have the best team. I always say I would put our team against any other team doing any other work. So I feel really fortunate to lead Tennessee Achieves. They just can't get rid of me, the one and only, because I just continue to stay. I love this work so much. But it is my pleasure and honor to moderate this panel of national experts who think about financial aid and promise programs and can really place Tennessee Achieves and Tennessee Promise among the ecosystem of other promise programs like it. And so I'm really excited to jump in. I did, in full disclosure, tell them that I was going to need to read their bios because they all have really impressive titles, and I want to make sure that I get this right. So first, we have Dr. Michelle Miller-Adams, who is a senior researcher at the Upjohn Institute and a professor of political science at Grand Valley State University. I will tell you, I don't think it's a secret, Michelle. She's working on a book, and she came to Tennessee, and she perhaps has asked the thoughtful questions I've ever had asked with regards to our work at Tennessee Achieves. So super thankful that you are joining us today. Next, we have Dr. Celeste Carruthers, who is an associate professor in the Haslam College of Business at the University of Tennessee, with a joint appointment in the Department of Economics and the Boyd Center for Business and Economic Research. I have told Celeste this since I think we've known each other at least a decade. She is one of the smartest people I've ever met, and I've met a lot of really smart people during my career. So thanks for being with us, Celeste. And then finally, Dr. Martha Kanter, who is the former Undersecretary of Education and now the CEO of College Promise. Martha's resume is quite impressive. And so I could spend this entire hour just providing accolades for Martha. So thank you for joining us, Martha. And we're going to kick off with you, talking about that impressive resume that you have. You're such a powerhouse leader of the College Promise. Tell us about what College Promise is and the progress that you've made now in 5 years, right?
Yes, this year we're celebrating the 5th anniversary of the College Promise campaign. It's now really the College Promise movement because of the work of so many of people around the country in local communities and now states, of course, led by Tennessee. We're in the Tennessee Promise celebrating 100,000th students served. But what's remarkable is, the work that the research community has done. Today we have Celeste and Michelle on board. We've got Promise programs represented around the country. We've been tracking them, not only in local communities, which we've now tracked over 328, And we have identified 30 states, which include the District of Columbia. It's not a state, so 29 plus the DC area, all of whom have done more than what we have historically provided for students to be able to afford and go to college. So the college promise itself, what is it? Well, if you think about Kalamazoo or Long Beach or Boston, what is the college promise? For us, it's a commitment that the local community has made. Oftentimes it's led by either a mayor, like in the case of the Knoxville Promise in Tennessee, or it's led by a university or a community college leader, or it's led, in the case of Detroit, by the Chamber of Commerce. So sometimes it's led by business. In the case of the Richmond Promise, it was dramatically led by the East Bay Community Foundation. Often it's led by business or government or education or community nonprofits. And I think the goal here has been, what can we do together that we couldn't do individually? So a commitment's made, a public assurance, some call it a trust, to fund a college education for all of the eligible students, and to really push the envelope, not only to clearly communicate, and Michelle has written about this quite a bit, what is a promise? Will it draw students in if college is free or if college is affordable? We know that college is paid for, but the controversy about free for college promise is really about getting a message out to students that just simply don't know. And the other part of the college promise is that we're pushing for supports for students, especially now with COVID. I just read a brief that talks about getting students more than, for example, a laptop, because so many students from low-income families don't have the access to technology that they need now to work remotely on a lot of their studies, or changing schedules for disconnected adults who are coming back into college who didn't know they had the opportunity. So the promise is really comprehensive. We have different models around the country. Many are focused on students from high school to through and beyond college. Others are adults, disconnected adults especially, and young people coming in for the first time. And some are solely targeted to meet workforce needs. So we have a wide variety. There's no perfect model, but the idea of College Promise is to learn from the best, get those best practices out, get them shared, and get communities coming forward to really support where we're going next with Promise.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, thank you, Martha, one of the things that we have heard over the last 13 sessions is that Promise really needs to be about more than the funding. Would you agree with that statement?
Absolutely. And I know, there's a lot of research to show that the mentoring, the coaching, student supports makes such a difference right now. I think many of the Promise programs are figuring out, how to accommodate the basic needs of students. We had one program, Say Yes Buffalo, actually delivering food, working with the community, with county and local services to get food to families that just couldn't go out in the early days of COVID. So it really is a wide variety. And I'd like, Michelle, do you want to weigh in, or Celeste on that? I think you're muted.
Michelle, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, to steal my own thunder, I think that if you are successful in making your message of tuition-free college clear and loud and inclusive, you're going to bring a lot of students into the post-secondary sphere who don't have family that's been to college, or who don't have peer groups that have been to college. And you're going to have students that are going to need more support, and not just academic support, or not even necessarily academic support, but more support around the norms of college going and how to be successful in a post-secondary education or training program. So it's critical that there be those mechanisms in place, as Martha said, and there's a lot of innovative thinking going on, much of it in Tennessee, around how best to provide that, especially at a large scale. So.
Yeah, I think I would agree with what's said. A lot of interesting research that's come out over the last 5 or even less than that years, has like demonstrated the success of programs that take kind of a holistic approach to addressing a given student's needs. So a lot of students have financial need, and so programs kind of like Promise or federal need-based aid and other scholarship programs can help to address that financial need, but students have a lot of need like beyond finances, and kind of student support systems that kind of take a case management approach to a given student's kind of logistical problems, kind of their schedule, their work schedule, their transportation to and from school, childcare, A to Z, have shown to be really successful at kind of increasing the likelihood that a student who enters community colleges, in particular, will complete a degree within a timely fashion. And so I'm seeing more programs that are starting to like include these wraparound supports in addition to financial aid, and paired oftentimes with something like Tennessee Promise or with Tennessee Achieves mentoring.
Yeah, I often say this, but it's, I think it's a smooshing of the two. In my mind, the funding's always been, you all have heard me say this, but the carrot, right, that brings students to, in our case, a program that really tries to wrap their arms around students and meet each individual student where they are at scale, which is hard. I mean, it's not easy to do at the scale at which, Tennessee Achieves, Tennessee Promise works. Sorry, Martha, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add, there are a number of programs that are now, given the COVID-19 environment we're in, really reaching out to the mental health professionals in their areas, in their local areas, to provide the kinds of supports that they really hadn't had. And I think the cross-sector communication between business, government, philanthropy, the nonprofits, foundations, is really getting access for these students to meet the mental health needs and some of the physical needs, like Celeste is mentioning, the transportation and other things that just weren't public in the public conversation. So I think it's really enabling that cross-sector collaboration that our students and families really need.
I think, to your point, also COVID has really heightened awareness of this need in the post-secondary space. I mean, we maybe all knew that it existed, but I think the alignment with the business and industry and in communities has really sort of shined the light, if you will, on other need, like laptop computers. We're running, you may know this, we're running the Knox Promise pilot now, which provides emergency grants. We call them completion grants for students. And so the entire first year of Knox Promise, we provided $35,000 in completion grants. And in the month of August, we provided $35,000 in completion grants leading into the fall. So we matched in 1 month what we had distributed over an entire year, and much of that was COVID related. Laptops for online learning, addressing food insecurity, addressing challenges with electricity bills, all the, a run of the gamut where students were addressing family needs of mom and dad have lost their jobs. And so here we are, and I want to go back to school. And so I think we'll continue to see more and more of that. Agree? I mean, I really do think that there's a need. And I think if there's an opportunity with COVID, this might be it.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I do think there are huge challenges in delivering the kind of what's sometimes called intrusive coaching or high touch coaching that Celeste describes, and that Celeste has actually researched as well. But it's really hard to provide that stuff in an online environment. So that's another challenge that I think just is a huge issue right now. How you have that trust and that ongoing relationship. I think about the cafes, the success cafes on some of the Nashville state campuses, and the ability to just kind of drop in and talk to someone. I guess we're all getting used to doing that in Zoom calls now, but it's not exactly the same.
Yeah, our coaches are telling us that their Zoom meetings have been beneficial, but not as effective as meeting face-to-face, right? Just as you would expect. Okay, Michelle, we're going to come over to you. You were at the ground level when Kalamazoo was launched. In my mind, the first real celebrated Promise program in the country. Talk to me at a high level about Kalamazoo, your role, and the impact that that program has had.
Right, I'm glad to, and thanks so much for including me today. I did have such a lovely visit to Tennessee and got to see both Celeste and Chrissy. Flew home into as things were shutting down around me. I think my daughter's school closed the next day. So the timing was kind of perfect. But yes, timing, there was a lot of serendipity in the presence of my presence in Kalamazoo in 2005 and the presence of the research institute that I work for, the W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research, which is a very old organization that studies issues of employment and unemployment and community vitality, and is based in Kalamazoo. I think it's fair to describe Kalamazoo as the first of the current generation of these place-based scholarships, from which have grown hundreds of local community programs and dozens of state programs, as Martha described. And what was unique about this model was this notion of place, that this was a bounded, that the criteria for getting the scholarship was not how good a student you were or how much financial need you had. The criteria were, where did you go to school and for how long? Were you a resident of, did you attend Kalamazoo Public Schools? So we knew immediately at the Upjohn Institute, I was not affiliated yet, I knew immediately that this was a pretty profound asset building strategy, which was something I was interested in. So I teamed up with the Upjohn Institute, and folks at Upjohn understood that this was not just about young people going to college, this was also about transforming the community. And that's what we were really interested in kind of capturing and studying, and what I spent 3+ years researching and wrote an initial book about. To date, still the only book about the Kalamazoo Promise, but anyone else is invited to come on in and write a new one. What was not expected is how other communities would look at this model, including Knoxville, and say, this makes sense for us, let's try to do this. And it's a model that's eminently tailorable to individual community needs. So we'd like to do it. We don't have as much money as they have in Kalamazoo, or we have, want to serve this student population. And so or we have these assets in our community. So what we saw was just this blossoming of this grassroots movement that spread around the country and then really kind of elevated through Tennessee up to the state level. So that was really, I think, a big surprise. And my own work evolved from following the Kalamazoo Promise and the Kalamazoo community, which I'm interested in because I live here, but expanding to really trying to understand the movement. And it's been really valuable to have Martha's College Promise organization as well, now providing some national leadership and advocacy around that. I guess the last thing I would say is that having watched this dissemination process and having given a lot of thought to the impacts of these programs and seeing the impacts that we saw in Kalamazoo, we developed this kind of 3-part framework of thinking about outcomes or impacts that's proved pretty robust. So when you think about some kind of college promise program, you can think in terms of its impact on, the most obvious impact is post-secondary outcomes, who's going to college or to post-secondary training, how are they doing, are they completing? That's kind of the most obvious one, but there are also changes that happen in the K-12 system, which you're all aware of. And so it's really interesting to see how these new tuition-free opportunities play out and change the experience for K-12 students. And then there are also these community level or state level changes that have to do more with economic development or community development. So there's this kind of broader sphere. And so I find that when I look at impacts, just based on the work we did in Kalamazoo and watching the movement roll out, I still tend to think in terms of that 3-part division of potential outcomes and impact. So I'll stop.
Yeah, no, I love that 3-part. And, I think one of the effects that we've seen specifically in Tennessee is that Promise provides a really solid foundation for which innovation grows. And so it has been a really interesting 5 or 6 years since Promise was introduced, because every conversation that I'm in, K-12, higher ed, the bridge between the two, really starts with, well, we have Tennessee Promise, therefore we should also have, this to address remediation or that to address the social emotional needs of students once they land in post-secondary. And so it has been really fun for me to see Tennessee Promise really provide a solid foundation for which innovation to grow in Tennessee. And I think it's really fun because when I started this journey 12 years ago, no one was really talking about Tennessee in a positive light with regards to education. So that has been a really fun shift to see over the last 12 years.
Yeah.
Okay, Celeste, we're going to turn it over to you. So during your career, you've studied financial aid and its effects on college choice with lots of other things that we'll dig into later. Will you describe this work and how or where Promise programs fit?
Yeah, absolutely. So over the last 10 years or so, I have studied how different kinds of financial aid kind of affect whether or not a student goes to college and where they go to college, focusing on Tennessee and focusing on merit-based aid, need-based aid, and what we'll call place-based aid or like Promise style aid. So merit-based aid is kind of like the Tennessee Hope Scholarship. To qualify, you need a particular ACT or a particular grade point average in high school. Lots of other states have merit-based aid programs going back, I think to the late 1990s. Tennessee's Hope Scholarship was modeled similarly after Georgia's Hope Scholarship, for example. And initially, these merit-based aid programs were the dollar amount of the scholarship was set to be at least kind of close to tuition and fees at the community colleges or four-year school. But of course, over the last 15 years or so, tuition and fees have grown really fast. And these merit-based scholarships have not kept pace with tuition and fee growth. In fact, in Tennessee, for the first couple of years, students get a little bit less from the Hope Scholarship than they used to. So need-based aid comes in a lot of different forms, both provided by the state, provided by institutions, provided by the federal government. The most common one is the federal Pell Grant. And currently this is worth up to $6,000 a year, a little bit more. And that would cover tuition and fees at Tennessee community colleges currently. To qualify for a Pell Grant, you have to have a certain income level. This is targeting lower income students and their families, although which income level would depend on a lot of other things. It would depend on like how many siblings you have in college. It would depend on if your parents have any assets or any kind of money in the bank, and you have to enter in all of these things into the FAFSA in order to determine if you're Pell eligible and how much Pell you're going to get. So that brings us to, and I should say that I guess to kind of put a ballpark figure on it, if you qualified for a reduced price lunch in high school, or you're probably eligible for a decent sized Pell Grant. Roughly half of Tennessee's high school graduates or more are eligible for Pell Grants, and about half of Tennessee Promise students have Pell Grants that measure up to tuition and fees at community colleges. So that brings us to Promise programs, which we'll call like place-based scholarships. So rather than having a certain GPA or a certain ACT or a certain family income level, the only requirement is that you kind of live in a well-defined place. So you live in Kalamazoo or you live in Tennessee. Kalamazoo Promise has additional like requirements about like how long you've lived there and attended the schools and things like that. As Michelle said, these are very kind of different across space, like the requirements, but the broad intent of these Promise programs is that the place criteria is number one, it's supposed to be simple and kind of easy to communicate, and beyond that, eligibility is not supposed to hinge on your ACT score or your income to reinforce the simplicity of that message. So compared to merit-based and need-based aid, many more students are potentially eligible, and this universal eligibility makes messaging just super, super easy. So a student asks their teacher, their counselor, their principal, their family member, can I get the Promise? And the answer is a pretty simple yes in most cases. So that's the landscape of financial aid that I've studied in Tennessee. And I think we'll be talking about a little bit more about what some of that research has shown coming up.
Yeah, I think that gives a really good foundation for us to think about, because I often get asked the question of why we built our Promise program the way we built it, right? I mean, I think that's usually the first question that someone asks. Why wasn't there a GPA cap, for example? Or why didn't you drive participation in high demand careers, all of which I think exists in the national landscape, right, Martha? I mean, there are all sorts of different parameters or guardrails around programs. At Kalamazoo, for example, you can, I'm right, Michelle, you can go to any Michigan state school. So it's not specific to community and technical colleges, right?
Right, it's 2-year and 4-year. It's all the publics and 15 of the privates, as well as some vocational training programs like apprenticeships. So it's very broad in terms of the higher ed options you can access. And in other communities, you have Promise programs that you can go to one local community college and that's it. So there's a really runs the gamut. There are a couple of programs where there's one program where you can go to any country and any higher ed institution in the US. They won't pay the full amount for every higher ed institution in the US, but you're free to go wherever. That's the El Dorado Promise.
Right. Yeah.
It's another feature at some kind of state programs or some kind of local programs. It's like a pledge type of feature. And so eligibility kind of is determined by a promise that the student makes when they're maybe an 8th grader or a 9th grader, that they're going to have good behavior, they're going to stay out of trouble, and they're going to get, certain grades, and then conditional on all of that, then they get a scholarship that'll cover X, Y, and Z at particular schools. That there was a earlier wave of those several years ago, kind of preceding the Promise era, but they're still around.
Right. Yeah. And I in my work, I generally call those like early commitment programs, and they're problematic in some ways. They're good in some ways. They're problematic in some ways, and we could come back to that if you want.
Yeah, we had that discussion early on. I remember those programs existing when we launched tnAchieves, where in 9th grade, you pledged that you would have a certain GPA and that you would meet certain benchmarks in math specifically. I remember having these early conversations. Martha, that's a lot to sort of wrap your arms around as a national promise movement. I would like to ask, where do you think that, or how do you think that Tennessee Promise has contributed to the national movement?
I mean, it's interesting because I remember actually contributing to a book in the 1980s on outcomes that was profiled and supported in Tennessee, and it was a national book to talk about outcomes. And I think one hallmark of what you've done in Tennessee is that you have really shown how continuing to improve, add features, change, and adapt to the evolution of giving students these opportunities has been so critically important. I think for the movement as a whole, to actually see a program that started in Knoxville as a great idea to bring people together to collaborate and to figure out, how could we get more students succeeding through the pipeline? What would be the incentives? What is the research to do that? How could that be done? And getting those, what I mentioned earlier, the cross-sector groups of business, education, government, the nonprofits, philanthropy, everyone engaged in a whole community approach, and then streamlining that up to the state level. So after Governor Haslam had been mayor of Knoxville, actually bringing the best of those ideas, looking across the country, looking at Kalamazoo and others to say, what could we do statewide? I think one of the genius moves in Tennessee was to look at how could you actually endow funds to make the funds less politically available to different twists and turns in the history of a community or a state or even the government. And that I think is one of the fundamental, that's why we put so much work in College Promise in our work to just use the words financial sustainability and to use the words research and policy to really kind of think through that evolution, which Tennessee has done. So you added serving adults. The University of Tennessee put its promise in place. So you went from a 2-year strategy to a broader strategy to include, the University of Tennessee and its campuses. So I think those kinds of things have really benefited. And then the other thing is, and one of our board members said this, Joe May from Dallas, who runs the Dallas County Promise, he said at one of our board meetings, who is in charge of the transitions? between the silos and the institutions themselves, between K-12 and higher education, even early learning. So when Michelle talks about the early promise programs, we look at, how are promises streamlining the pathways? And that's the other thing that I think Tennessee has really done, is to identify, how can we get students to really maximize the time they have for college, in addition to the scholarship, with the student supports, to get a quality educational experience with the right pathways.
Yeah, I think all those things were so important to us, specifically the financial sustainability piece, right? I mean, I remember when in those early conversations when we were whiteboarding Tennessee Promise, trying to piece all of the finances together and realizing that we didn't want to forever chase money, and we didn't want this to be something that was a year-to-year allocation. That was really important. And I believe, had we not figured out the endowment, we would not be having this conversation today, because the leadership was very, very clear about, if we're doing this, we want to be able to do it in perpetuity.
And the other thing you did, or two other things that I think are really incredible, were to have a goal of, and I would love to see this as a national goal, to have every student have that wraparound, have a mentor. And, Tennessee has done this at scale to reach out to the communities. We can debate the quality of different kinds of mentoring programs, but it's the idea that you can wrap this around students and help them stay on track, especially first generation students. And then the other thing is, to really emphasize the importance of community service. Some call it earning your promise, but I just call it, becoming, a really great community participant that can contribute and appreciate the place that you're in and that you're growing from and with. So I love the fact that, you take students on these statewide opportunities that now the state has come forward and said, if you want to provide some community service, we want you here or there to help us with environment or to help us in our schools. So it's building that culture of service that I think is also really, really great.
Well, I think that Randy Boyd, our chairman, and Governor Haslam probably had that insight that we would need community service, or that buy-in, that students had some skin in the game in order, in a pretty hyper red state, to get something statewide passed. I just thought it was really great that students were out participating in their community. So, but it was some great foresight on their part. So Michelle, we talked about you're writing a book on promise programs. I hope that's not a secret. This is early publicity for you, right?
Right.
So any early conclusions that you would share with us around what makes a successful promise program?
Sure. It's so not a secret that it's actually done. I delivered.
Oh, yay. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. I had to get back to getting ready to be able to go teach. So I will say the pandemic slowed me down a little bit, because I was busy writing about the booming economy and the low unemployment rate. And I was writing about Tennessee and the Tennessee Promise and Tennessee Reconnect, and the need for training to help businesses have access to more educated workers in a context of historically low unemployment rates. And I was literally writing that in, February and the beginning of March. And then, a few weeks later, we had historically high unemployment rates. So I really had to give some thought to what was going on. But of course, I came down in the place of saying that you still need higher education, access to post-secondary education and training. Now you need it for the workers who need to have access to better jobs at a time when there are real challenges around low skilled work. So the book is done, it's coming out. It's called The Path to Free College in Pursuit of Access, Equity, and Prosperity. And the main, to give you just a very high level finding, it tries to be a really high level book that talks about the evolution of the local, state, and national discussion around tuition-free college. I would say my four biggest takeaways are that free is a powerful word. I think you've all said that at one time or another. Free is the word that makes people's ears perk up, or as Governor Haslam says, you talk about over the dinner table. It's what brings people into the process. If your program is well designed, it's going to be simple to explain, and it's going to have support elements baked in, as we've been talking about for the past half hour. But the other thing that I think I can add to this is that there's a lot of design by improvisation and by emulation in the promise field, where a community will say, yeah, we want to do that, but we don't have as much money, so instead we're going to do this. There's not enough understanding of how the design of programs relates to outcomes. And that's partly because the whole research and evaluation field is deeply under-resourced. And I'm very appreciative of College Promise for its effort to create this thing called the College Promise Research Network. The Upjohn Institute has done a bit of convening of researchers, including Celeste, who's part of a study we're doing right now on the workforce outcomes of Promise programs. But the research base for this whole free college movement is not as robust as we would like it to be. So the message is that when you're designing a tuition-free college program or a free college program, you really have to think about what your goals are as stakeholders and design for those goals. So my book's actually broken down into a discussion of college affordability, equity, and workforce or employment, and tries to make the point that each of those rationales call out for somewhat different program structure and program design. And when you ask communities or states what they want to do, stakeholders will usually say, well, we want to do all of those things. And those are all good things. We want to make college more affordable. We want to have greater equity. We want to have a better educated workforce and a more competitive economy. But you kind of have to rank order them if you're going to really think about developing a program that will help you meet those goals. The last high-level point in the book is based in some historical discussion about free college in California and New York City and the high school movement, but it really tries to make the case that that affordable access to higher education is not just in the interest of individuals who receive that education, but it's in the public interest and it's worthy of public investment. So College Promise programs have this wonderful attribute of having private value and public value, or another way to put it is individual benefit and collective benefit. And so even if you're not someone who has a kid who might be able to go to a school district and get a tuition-free college education, it may very well be in your interest as the resident of a community, a state, or the United States that there is affordable, equitable access to higher education. And I don't think we really talk about that enough. I have a colleague who says if we were trying to design high school right now, people would probably say, well, I don't know, why should I pay for somebody else's kid to go to high school? There is a good reason to pay for that. We might not come out with the K through 12 universal free education system that we have. So that's kind of the key takeaway of my book. It'll be coming out, I hope, early-ish in 2021.
That's great. Well, I would love a copy. I've got to find one. That'd be, thank you.
You mentioned it a few times, Chrissy, so you will definitely get a copy.
I definitely want a copy. I hope all nice things, Michelle.
All nice things, yeah.
So Celeste, I think Michelle makes a great point around a lack of research between program design and outcomes. I will say one of the gifts that we have had at Tennessee Achieves is that you and Dr. Bill Fox have been really at the ground level, much like Michelle was with Kalamazoo, with Knox Achieves, taking a deep dive into our work, which has really helped me evolve the program and decide what comes next. Can you talk a bit about what your findings have been?
Yeah, happy to. It has been an exciting 10 years to be a higher education and financial aid researcher in Tennessee. I'm just very grateful and feel very fortunate I was in the right time at the right place and knew the right people who were behind all of this innovation and interested to learn more about how it was working. As far as what I've found, I've had a few different research studies, like one on Tennessee Hope, one on Pell grants for Tennessee students, and one going on three, on Knox Achieves and other kind of place-based Tennessee scholarships. And what we found, we saw larger and more noticeable effects, more noticeable positive effects on college going coming out of place-based tnAchieves than out of the federal Pell Grant and out of merit-based Tennessee Hope Scholarships. And this is consistent with what people have found in other states as well. And it makes a little bit of sense. Like merit-based aid such as Hope is going to go to a lot of students who probably were going to go to college anyway. You know, they had ACTs over 21, they were B or A students. That's not to say that it doesn't help family budgets. I'm sure that they greatly appreciate the scholarship aid, but it's not going to be the lever that helps a student decide to go to college versus, you know, putting it off for a few years or going into work or going into the military. Need-based aid is supposed to target those students who are kind of at that margin, but the way that federal Pell Grant determination used to happen, the timeline was such that students had to jump through kind of such a long process and so many hoops to kind of determine what type of federal financial aid that they would get, that by the time they go through all of that, I think students are pretty well committed to going to college or not at the time they find out if they're Pell eligible, what kind of Pell Grant they're going to get. And even then the message is kind of very muddied with kind of other aid letters that they're getting from their colleges and universities that kind of complicate this, what is a loan versus what is a scholarship. And it's all a very confusing process. So Promise Aid enters kind of a family and a student's decision about college in a very different way. They hear about it earlier. They know about it kind of before spring of their senior year. They know that they're going to be eligible. And it just vastly simplifies what the cost of college is going to be. And so for a student whose grades maybe aren't so good or who is apprehensive about the cost of college, this wrecking ball of a message that says college is free and it's free for you can make a real difference in whether or not they go. And so we found that with the introduction of tnAchieves raised the college going percent by 3 to 5 percentage points. It's kind of our range of estimates in 2009 to 2011. So to put that in context, at that time, about 46% of high school seniors were going straight to college the next year. And we're saying that tnAchieves going to bump that up to about 50%. And we saw a similar size bump with the introduction of Tennessee Promise. And the model as scaled was very similar to what tnAchieves had introduced to Knox County seniors way back in 2009. We see some consistency across like the effects of that very similar model when it was introduced to one county versus when it was introduced statewide. And so in ongoing work where I'm assessing whether these students who were induced to go to college because of the introduction of tnAchieves stayed there, whether they were more likely to attain a 2-year college degree or a 4-year college degree. And we're also looking at the effects of the expansion from tnAchieves to Tennessee Achieves and then later Tennessee Promise on those K-12 outcomes. So one of the selling points of this program is that it's going to change students' horizon. It's going to push that horizon and change it to potentially include college and keep that door open. And that is going to have an upstream effect on their academics as K-12 students. And so we are going to assess whether there was a change in students' engagement with school, their absenteeism, ACT scores, other such things that we can observe at statewide.
All super helpful. Yeah, it's been really great to have troops on the ground in the research space for us. And each time we get a report, I feel like my brain explodes with all the great information coming out. Okay, final question before I bring Graham back on to provide any questions from the audience. But this is for all of you, so feel free to jump in. What do you think is next for Promise programs, and how should Tennessee Achieves shift to meet current student and workforce need? That's a loaded question.
I mean, I can jump in and just say when I think about the future, and there's a book called Working to Learn. I don't think we as a country have really recognized the urgent need for so many youth and adults to work during college. And even in middle school and high school, we're finding many low-income students working to meet family needs And so I think we need to rethink the integration of working and learning in school. And I think, all the way up. I think also the integration has to look at also financing structures. I've been doing a lot of work in College Promise, integrating children's savings accounts with College Promise dollars, because really when you look at the amount of unmet need for students to live and work and go to school, there is a gap that maybe was far closer 50 years ago. And that reality is just that our students are going to need to work. College Promise is going to have to look at multiple funding streams, which many are doing, but I think there are untapped ways to actually create what Tennessee has done. Those endowments are stable funding streams. We're seeing that in states that really haven't been able to think this through very well and wanted to do it. It was a great idea, but now with this recession, again, I think this is my 6th or 7th recession, to pull back on funding streams because there isn't a reserve approach. Or a way to stabilize that. So I think those are the kinds of things that we're thinking about at College Promise, and using the word integration to say, how can we break down these silos that still exist, doing a good job with the different leadership, but how can we take the structures, the pathways, and make them much more intentional? Michelle?
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say a word about this issue of financial sustainability. The Tennessee situation where your funding is safely ensconced in your lottery reserve, or in the case of Tennessee Reconnect, your lottery earnings, is very rare. Most statewide programs are funded out of the state budget. And we all know there's a massive fiscal crisis for states coming up. And when states experience fiscal crisis, one of the first places they cut is higher education. We saw that in the 2008 recession, and even 10 years later, funding for higher ed in many states had not returned to the pre-recessionary levels. So that's something I worry about deeply, and it's kind of a slow-moving train wreck that we see coming. Realistically, I think the opportunity of extending tuition-free post-secondary education and training opportunities for all is going to need to rest on federal policy. And I think that it's important to note that the Biden-Harris team has proposed for their administration several different free college initiatives, which would need congressional support to get enacted. But it's funny, when I started writing my book, I thought, no way are we going to see a national free college initiative anytime soon. I don't even have to talk about it. And by the time I was finishing up my book, I really did need to talk about it. And Martha was very helpful in helping me talk about it. So thank you. So one of the interesting questions is, if we do wind up with some kind of national free college funding structure, what happens to existing programs, to state and local programs? Is there a way? I don't think anyone has given really serious thought yet, and maybe it's too early to do that, to the articulation of existing programs and a new source of federal funding. So that will be something to think about. But to be honest, when we look at the magnitude of, we have this wonderful movement, but it's very patchy, and it's created this sort of odd patchwork system of, if you live here, you have these opportunities, and if you live here, you don't, or you have some other opportunities. It's not a really great approach to enriching the nation's human capital. So those are just my thoughts on maybe where we're going. I don't know.
Great.
I will second and third the importance of the financial sustainability of these programs. And since that was covered, and since we already talked about kind of additional supports for students beyond financial aid, because there's still a lot of need, I'll at least point to another slow moving train wreck to be aware of, and that is resources for public 2-year and 4-year colleges, state appropriations in particular. The higher ed landscape is one that's getting more expensive because it's a people business, and people are getting more expensive. Their health benefits are getting more expensive. The IT infrastructure, the security infrastructure, all of these things are getting more expensive, but states are increasingly constrained in how much they can allocate of their recurring appropriations to higher education, because they have other things that are also getting more expensive. And so I'm very concerned that something is going to give. Either the quality of the education that we can deliver in 2-year and 4-year schools is going to diminish with whatever cost-cutting measures we have to take, or there's going to be more pressure on tuition. So far in the midst of the COVID crisis, the colleges and universities in Tennessee have committed to keeping tuition flat and not growing it. It's going to be hard to do that if we don't find other ways to keep the quality of education high, but affordable both to the state and to the students at the same time.
Right. And then the burden lies once again with students and families, right? And programs like ours sort of scrambling to figure out how to help. So that's a really great flag. Graham, any questions from the audience? This has been such a great conversation.
Yes, this has been really interesting. We have a question from Carla who's asked, if any of you have other examples of ways to reach out to students during this time of low on-campus attendance while students are learning online. And then she kind of also asked about engaging their parents and what are your opinions on engaging parents in this process?
I'll just say a quick word about the latter half of that question about parents. It's really, really, really hard to engage parents. It's even hard to engage parents in the K through 12 space where you kind of have them a little more captive. And the reality is that, but I mean, Carla raises a really important point. What is magical about turning 18 and going to college where all of a sudden, you know, the parents are not really supposed to have any role in supporting young adults while they're in college emotionally or socially or academically, or understanding even what that college experience is. The higher ed institutions that do the very best job of engaging parents, in my opinion, are small liberal arts colleges. And Chrissy, I know you can speak to that. The small liberal arts college in our community is the one with the parents' weekends and the parents' days and the parents' clubs, and the large public university, the community college, the students are really on their own. So I think it's a really tough question. Yeah, that's all I'll say.
I think one way that some of the Promise programs are having a lot of success is to engage Promise students who are already in college, to reach out. Some call it a near peer mentoring program. There are different names for that kind of thing, but to actually engage the students who are receiving, or graduates, you know, alums who've received the benefits, because again, we're talking about Promise programs 10, 20 years in the making, and having them reach back to become the mentors of the students who are not only transitioning into, I just did a whole thing that Richmond is doing on summer melt, all their strategies to prevent summer melt and what they did this summer. But also on the parent side, some of the Promise programs have parent engagement committees. And that's where the cross-sector leadership in the communities or at the state level can listen to parents, can team up with PTAs and other groups that are already scheduled and say, what more can we do to help our students persist? So I think, you know, partly sometimes higher education thinks we've got to do this all ourselves and we don't have the resources and we're facing this cliff now with the recession coming up. But I think there are things that can be done when we, I think, cross the silos.
I'll just add that anecdotally, I've heard from tnAchieves mentors that parents are a really important group to talk to and to reach. They're part of a student's circle of trust, and convincing a parent and advocating to them the value of college and how their students can get the most out of college is a really important part of the process sometimes.
Another really interesting question I thought, it says, what is a post-secondary innovation or problem that the common person that doesn't do this work every day might be unaware of, but should know about?
Well, I jump in, you know, the American Association of Colleges and Universities has a whole list of 10 things that several thousand institutions are doing already to give that first year experience a grounding. So when Promise students come in, are they in a cohort? Do they have a research experience in the freshman year, or are they working to solve an important problem no matter what courses they're in? And a lot of faculty have really taken leadership in the undergraduate curriculum to make it far more directed to the kinds of experiences that are going to inspire and motivate students, whether it's doing an environmental cleanup or whether it's working, in the healthcare community, especially given the COVID and contact tracing and other aspects of that have just come up. Are there ways to leverage that engagement so students can really do well and stay motivated, and then have the promise support and the mentoring and the other activities that we talked about? So I would refer you to that, because there is a whole long list of things that people are doing that are really exciting. And I think, you mentioned also the cafes. Some of these cafes have gone virtual. So labs online and things like that to really connect students, even though it's through Zoom or through their phones or however it is, ways that better connect and engage students.
Dr. Kanter, do you have that resource readily, easily available? Someone in the chat has asked if she could have access to it.
Yeah,
or,
I'll try to find it while we're finishing.
Or if you can email it to me, I will get it to her.
Okay.
Anyone else like to add to that?
I just reinforce that the process of building community is something that we put a lot of work into, whether it's for an online class or for an on-campus cohort of students or for a class of students. And kind of when you can find that spark of kind of community where everyone is kind of bought into the class and to kind of being there together, it's just so much easier to teach and so much more rewarding.
Yeah, and I'm also in the classroom and not in the classroom this semester. And I'll say that is that's the biggest challenge teaching in an online or a partially online environment, I think, is building that community and also finding ways for students to really be active learners. There's something about the online delivery of content that makes people kind of passive. They sit and listen rather than actively engaging. And I'm encountering all kinds of issues in the classroom right now that are really, they're pedagogical. They have to do with learning. And, we all have spent many years learning how to teach effectively in a classroom, but we have not spent many years learning how to teach effectively online. And I think that's true for Chrissy, for the support services that Tennessee Achieves offers as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think just the adjustment of online has been, I will say this on a positive note. I always tend to talk about sort of the challenge, but I will say on a positive note, the 16 coaches we have that have been actively engaged over the summer and into the fall with students say that that students are much more optimistic about online learning this fall than they were March and April. I don't know if that's because they came in knowing that this was the environment versus that shift that happened so abruptly. But we are hearing positive stories from students. Some are preferring online altogether. And so I do think that this shift, and we talked a bit about it yesterday with Chancellor Tidings with our Tennessee Board of Regents, this has to shift higher education forever in terms of how we think about education delivery systems.
I think we might have time for one more, then I'll turn it back over to Chrissy to close this out. Again, thank you to our panelists for being here today. But as we stop and celebrate this first 100,000 students that Tennessee Achieves has sent to college, Jackie on our team is asking, what are some other innovative programs around the country? Where can we be looking to learn some new things as we continue to work towards this next 100,000?
I will mute myself and see if I can dig up the resource, but there was a really cool program in Fort Worth Community Colleges that it gave students access to a case management style coach or advisor that substantially kind of helped them persist through and complete college. So I'll go dig that up there as something interesting to keep in mind. I think it's very on the theme of kind of a holistic approach to supporting students.
And I'll just add to that, the work of the Detroit Promise has been quite interesting in that area. They have practiced that kind of case management, high touch coaching model, and it's been rather rigorously evaluated by MDRC. It's called the Detroit Promise Path. And the results were so promising that MDRC found that the Detroit Promise last year or 2 years ago decided to start providing all of its students with those high touch coaching services rather than doing this randomized experiment. So that's a good principle to follow in evaluation. When you find something that really works, might be time to call off the experiment and actually make it available to everybody.
Yeah, and you know, at Los Angeles Valley College, they have a promise and they put in a family resource center. And because of their relationship with the county, they've got a social worker now working with students, same thing for Say Yes Buffalo. So it really is reaching out to not have education do it all by themselves, but to look across and form the relationships that create the trust and the impact.
Martha is absolutely right about that cross-sectoral alignment need. And that happens on the back end too when it comes to employment. So just getting people to and through higher ed and then sending them off into the workforce is good, but it's even better if you have those ties with employers and they're interacting with the higher ed institutions and providing opportunities for local or state people with now higher credentials.
Well, thank you. This has been such a gift to close out the 100,000th student enrolled with Tennessee Achieves with the three of you. So thank you so much for your time and your expertise and your leadership in a space that I think is critically important to student success. So I appreciate all of you, not only for your support of our program, but also for your friendship and for answering my emails and calls. So I'm really super grateful. Thank you so much.
Thanks to all of you folks in Tennessee doing this work and showing it can be done at a large scale. It's really, really important. So
thanks, Michelle.
bye,
Thank you
everybody.
all.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. It's been a great afternoon.
Lovely.